But I think that it is ironic, all of that aside, I think it's ironic that we mark the International Day for the Elimination of Racial Discrimination next week as questions are being raised about the existence of racism in Canadian society and its impact in the lives of racialized people today. I have to say that in introducing me, Estella made reference to a task force that I co-chaired this past year at RISE and looking at racism in the institution, and I felt the pangs of criticism and ridicule as soon as the report was out. The mainstream media, particularly the Globe and Mail and the National Post, along with some radio outlets, have continued to tie themselves in knots over the findings that racism is a systemic problem in the post-secondary institutions, and particularly Ryerson University, not recognizing that this is not exactly a new observation of findings, certainly not for the racialized population that is associated with Ryerson University or with the post-secondary institutions in Canada. Let's recognize that post-secondary institutions were created by and for European descendants, and their responsibility was to establish a basis for training young people to transition into a Canadian project which from the beginning was highly racialized. And so it is not a surprise for me that we would find that that experience continues today, because the reality is that very little has been done in terms of the necessary reforms that would change the curriculum, the Eurocentric curriculum, or the mode of operation that have traditionally been used to educate the Canadian population, because it's been educated for the purposes of maintaining a Eurocentric society. That was the original Canadian project, and unless and if we revisit that project, it is inevitable that the institutions that were created for the purposes of feeding that project will continue to be highly racialized and particularly Eurocentric. That was the project. It was the project at the beginning of Canadian time, at a time when a white nation was substituted for Aboriginal nations, not just a single nation, but Aboriginal nations. So it stands to reason that if the original project was to build a white Canada, the youth that were being prepared for that society, and youth were being prepared for that society, it requires a deliberate, oversized effort if we are to reverse the impact of all the manner of legislative and institutional imperatives that were deployed for the purposes of ensuring that fact. All the exclusions, the exclusion acts and the legislation that was brought to bear that denied access to Canada for Chinese people, South Asian people, enslaved Africans who were free from the United States seeking to come into Canada. I've always asked this question in my class. Imagine what would have happened if you had 100 years of continuous Asian migration to Canada. Imagine if there had not been the disruption in the process of migration, which was a natural process from Asia in the late 1800s, in the early 1900s. What would Canada look like? Because obviously in the media in the last couple of days we've heard stories about what Canada will look like 20 years down the road, a lot of that attributed to migration. What would Canada have looked like, and what would have happened to that white nation project if those decisions had not been made by the political leaders at the time? Decisions that, by the way, were supported by much of the population. Those were not simply elite decisions. Those were decisions that were supported by much of the population at the time. So when I hear people saying that not only is Canada colorblind, but Canada is not really racialized or racial, or that the elite has not continuously taken race into consideration when making decisions, I wonder what it is that they're talking about. You know, at every turn, Canadian history shows us that the Canadian political elite, the Canadian business elite, the Canadian cultural elite have always been highly racially conscious. They've always been highly racially conscious. Because we tend to talk about race as being a phenomenon that only applies to racialized people. But that is not necessarily the case. Race is a phenomenon that applies to racialized people as well as those who racialize them. Otherwise, they would not be racialized. You know, those who have power to racialize are highly racially conscious in the decisions they make. When the Global Mail talks about, when the Global Mail attempts to ridicule the work that we're doing, right? In many ways, it is because they are masking their high racial consciousness. It isn't because it is absent or evacuated. The reality of Canadian society has been and continues to be that race is a basis for determining access to privilege and securing that privilege and ensuring that advantages are assigned to particular groups in society at the expense of others. Racialization is a process that is used to establish racial hierarchies in the economy and in social life. It is used to justify the differentiation of peoples on the basis of socially selected physical traits for the purpose of acquiring or maintaining an advantage for one group over the other. These categories then tend to acquire social significance within society and then define processes of social stratification and the identities that arise from those processes. It is important to recognize that these processes are dynamic, that they are not time-bound. These processes continue in Canadian society, and they may be more intense at different points in time than others, but they certainly continue through history. And so when we talk about race and racism, and the salience of racism, it's important for us to talk about it from the point of view of structural racism. And an acknowledgement that structural racism is a process that ensures the establishment of what essentially are racialized regimes that determine certain outcomes, even when on a daily basis people do not necessarily set out to seek those outcomes. They determine certain outcomes that are inevitable because they are built within in the structure and the social and institutional arrangements that determine access to resources in society, that determine who gets what benefits out of processes of production, out of cultural and social processes, and who is disadvantaged by those processes. So the process of distribution of resources in society are it's important for us to recognize the extent to which they are racialized. And I think it's important for us to look at it from the point of view of regimes. And this is to some extent controversial because Canadian society has had a hard time acknowledging or embracing the existence and persistence of particular processes that lead to the unequal racialized outcomes that we see today, and I'll talk about in just a moment. But Krasner says that regimes are a set of explicit and implicit principles, norms and rules and decision-making procedures around which actors' expectations converge. Actors' understandings and expectations and convictions that legitimize certain outcomes, that establish particular moral behavior in a given environment. I see Estella looking at a clock. I think it is important to see how regimes, racialized regimes, have in many ways determined the course of Canadian history. Right? This is not very difficult, by the way, to argue when you're talking about Aboriginal people. Right? White society concedes that, but it doesn't concede it and then do something about it. It doesn't. It simply concedes it and says, that's in the past. We need to move on. But does not address or redress the impact and implications of the process of colonization. Right? But in an interesting way, as racialized bodies, we are also subjects and victims of a process of colonization, because we're inserted into a frame that is already pre-existing, that establishes a hierarchy within which Europeans are reserved certain roles, and those who are people of color are reserved, are expected to conform to another role.